women's work. So it is the whole problem of not feeling that you've done anything. And we get a lot of young women coming doing their thesis, and they think that there might be a woman that has done some work, and they'll come and find that there's shelves and shelves of women that have worked. And there is a place where they can find that they're not reinventing the wheel, that that there's history behind them. And I guess when you have a history, you have a future.
I was brought up in Devon during and after the war when I was small. And it was a long time I didn't realise that there was any difference between boys and girls, because I was brought up with two small boy cousins who were a little older than me, and we all wore dungarees, and we all had our pudding basin haircuts, and we all played the same games, and we all had a fair share in the parts. And then at some magical age, I suppose they were 7 or 8 or whatever age, they went off to prep school, and they arrived back with grey shorts and blazers and calling me a sissy. And suddenly I realised that I was in some way different, and I was given from then on awful demeaning roles like rat in the games that we played, and they brought awful school friends back, and I was just left out after a bit. And that was a really great blow to me. I mean, I still feel quite upset when I think about it, because, you know, it was a real shock. My experiences as an actress, except when I was at Worthing Rep for a year, which was wonderful because I was playing absolutely everything as you do in Rep, and I could do my Pygmalion and my French maid and everything. But once I was in the business playing in, they used to have Tatty's second feature films in those days, and it was Tatty's second feature films and television, the Dixon of Dock Greens and Emergency Ward 10s and things, and one was always just playing, you know, perhaps a nurse or a barmaid or a prostitute or something. You never had a really good part you could get your teeth into.
She was murdered.
I'm afraid so.
I couldn't believe it when I first saw her picture. Oh, well, she always wanted to be famous. Looks like she got her wish.
Well, she was a friend of yours?
We went to copy bar.
And this, of course, is when I started writing myself at the same time as I was acting, and determining that, if nothing else, I would always write good parts for women, and perhaps particularly for older women, since they had an even worse lot in that nobody wrote for them at all, except maybe the mother-in-law in a comedy series or something like that. I enjoyed being an actress in many ways, but I didn't enjoy what being an actress meant to other people. In other words, very often the press and so on, which still happens now, in that one was invariably, because I was then young, photographed, spread out in some sort of leotard or leg show, teddy bears climbing all over you or something. And this, of course, was very alien to the person that wanted to be writing about women and facing women's rights.
I was always a very good girl, and I never cut school. And I mean, all my other friends, I seem to have run with a very wild crowd, but I never really managed to be as wild as my crowd. And I cut school one day, and we went to the museum. Always used to wander around, and there were these wonderful paintings, and there was one that was attributed to David, and it was a woman sitting down and drawing, and it's a very atmospheric picture. Now, I just always thought this was one of the best pictures in the world, but and it turned out years later that it was actually done by a woman. But it just never occurred to me that this painting of this woman who was painting was painting, and it all of a sudden, when I was going through women's art books some 20 years later, did I discover it, and it just, things all of a sudden, it made me reevaluate every painting I ever saw. And I mean, how could when I see a painting of a woman holding a palette and a brush, why do I think that she is the muse as opposed to the artist? Now I don't. Now I assume she is the artist. But it is that whole way of conditioning that women inspire as opposed to do.
First of all, the first British company I actually worked for was a group of women called Cunning Stunts, who, bless their little souls, saved my life, I think, because their approach to theatre and life and art was just so different to anything I'd come across. I was quite shocked when I first met them, but I was so intrigued I couldn't resist going to work with them. And they were an all-women group, and they were into lots of ideas, but breaking down the mould of what women do in comedy.
We are the spinners, the spinsters, the black widows.
We travelled around Europe and Ireland, having a great time, shocking the natives, and drinking whatever the local beverage was, and trying to dispel traditional images of women, really.
Women on the whole are pretty tough writers, and often you get a male director or producer or script editor or something saying women wouldn't talk like this, and maybe changing a word to something softer. The next thing you know, you're reading a notice where it's saying how cosy it all is. I've known plays, for instance, a writer friend of mine wrote a play that took place, she was in the army, and it was about women in the army, and she was told by a producer that women on their own wouldn't talk like that. This sort of remark I've heard again and again, and indeed found it myself, that there's a sort of softening of what males would like the image to be as opposed to what it really is.
So they don't want you to be aggressive, they want you to support them in the way that they think they ought to be supported. They don't want to be challenged, they want you to be terribly nice and smile and to look good and to be terribly polite. To be a partner, I think, in the way that men think women ought to by and large, and to service them by and large.
I suppose I'm thinking of Tenko, perhaps, where we had a very good male producer who, you know, I would defend to the hilt, and it's rather mean to pick on him, perhaps, but something that I do remember very early on was a story that I wanted to do about a relationship between two of the women in the camp. It seemed to me ludicrous to have several hundred women in a camp for some years and to pretend that they didn't have relationships. Indeed, we'd heard from women who we'd spoken to who were in the camps that there had been special friends, as they called them. But to begin with, they said no, that I couldn't write that storyline, that it would be unpopular, that it would be switch-off time. And then somebody else would dig him in the ribs and say, don't you mean switch-on time? Both of which made me equally angry. But I was in a good position at that particular time because they needed the scripts in, and I said I wouldn't really want to continue writing on the series if one couldn't deal with a situation that so obviously would have occurred in the way that one could deal with euthanasia and other subjects which just occurred because of the situation. So in the end, some compromise was reached whereby I could write the story, but I wasn't to mention the word lesbian.
I mean, it's a very contentious area if there's a difference between the art that women and men produce. I mean, I think there is. I think there's a great difference. If only because, you know, men are going to write about the things they're interested in, and women are going to concentrate on their own preoccupations. And I think these preoccupations are gender-based to a reasonable degree or not. And it's my experience with visual arts and literature. And I mean, in particular literature, I mean, I very seldom read a book these days that's written by a man. And I don't feel that it's, I mean, I live with a man. I don't feel that it's sort of some incredible resentment that I'm carrying around with me. I just enjoy reading the way that women write, because they write. I'm sure it's to do with this emotional base, you know, that women do work off the emotions so much more than men, in my experience. Men try to suppress their emotions and say, you know, as if they don't exist, whereas we all know that they do, and in abundance, and wash around the world and cause all sorts of problems. But But yes, I do think there is a considerable difference. And also I got to a certain point where I found that men's writing was somehow just a little trite and a little smug, you know. It was sort of the writing of people who knew they had the upper hand in a way.
I don't know. My vision is different from a man's because my experience is different than a man's. Maybe not in everything, but in a lot of things. I've seen work done by women about motherhood that isn't this glossy, idealized view of motherhood. I've seen work of, this one woman did this image of a woman pushing a cart with a screaming child and a backpack loaded with groceries. Now, this is not an ideal of motherhood, but every mother that went by this piece identified with it. So when you are dealing with work that is from everything that you do, your work does become different, and your writings become different, your art becomes different, because you're reflecting yourself and not necessarily reflecting somebody else's preconceived ideas of what art is or what creativity is.
We formed a company called Die Hard Productions, and we brought over Judy Chicago's Dinner Party from the States, where we shipped 2 40-foot sea cargo containers of an art installation across the Atlantic, and really renovated 2 spaces, one in Edinburgh and one in London, to become galleries where we put the installation on, and where over 50,000 people attended this extraordinary piece of work. I think it's quite difficult to go through life with the feminist label. For women, I think women are afraid of it because, particularly during the 60s and 70s, it was painted, you know, like if you're a feminist, you're sort of a lesbian in greasy overalls with 2 heads and probably carrying around a little saw in your pocket to sort of lop off men's willies or something, I don't know. But it was, I mean, it's this terrible sort of almost fear of castration because you're a feminist, like deep. And that is both off-putting to both men and women. You know, lots of women don't want to be seen in that light.
I suppose for me, the real breakthrough came when I stopped wanting to be a boy, because all my life I thought that my problems would have been solved had I been a boy. But there comes a moment when you realise that it's not being a boy, but being able to do the things that a boy does. So then I started to want to be a girl, a woman, who could do the things that men did if I so wished. And I think probably that was the big breakthrough. There are still not that many women writing in the sort of prime spots in television for various reasons. And I think that the more that they do, the more work there will be for actresses. Similarly, the more women directors and producers there are. There will be encouraging projects that perhaps deal more with those sort of themes. And I don't mean the sort of feminist series shoved away in, you know, in some corner and labelled feminist, but just things about people that happen to be women, and that's what we want. Not to even be thought of as, you know, women writers all the time, but to be able to write parts for people that happen to be women sometimes and not always men.
This is a collage piece of photocopy art, and it's with 2 images of myself where I've stitched the pieces together, and it's the image of myself as an adult and one as a child, and also the whole child against the brick wall, and it's the supposedly innocent child, but by that age I had been sexually abused, so I was not an innocent child, and the image of myself as an adult, supposedly knowing, but the older I get, the less